All right, as we start to take a look at the Civil War, we're going to do so in two parts. We're going to take a look at the first years of the Civil War up until about 1863 and the Emancipation Proclamation. So we're going to go for the first couple of years and take a look at the war, and then see how the war changes after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, and the war shifts more towards a war to free the slaves. In the beginning, the war seemed to be more of a war to preserve the Union, and but that certainly will shift after 1863. To remind you guys, we talked a little bit about before we left going virtual. We talked a little bit about how the war starts, and we've spent a lot of time talking about the complexities of slavery, the complexities of the expansion of slavery, the complexities of the states' rights ideology, and finally, we've started to talk a little bit about how the secession question, which goes all the way back to the beginning of our class when we talked about the Virginia and Kentucky resolves, that we uh, we now have the ability to take a look at the final stage at that, and that, of course, is secession. In 1860, we talked about how Lincoln was able to win the election in a very split field. The Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln won 180 electoral votes, but really only got about 40% of the popular vote because the field was so split. The uh, the opposing political party, the Democrats, split along southern and northern lines. Southern states felt like they couldn't trust Stephen A. Douglas and to hold up his end of the bargain about popular sovereignty and allowing slavery to expand in places like Kansas. And so they bolted from really the Northern Democrats and established the Southern Democratic Party and ran John C. Breckinridge. And there was even a third party, the Constitutional Union Party, under John Bell. With that split of a field, Lincoln was able to secure enough electoral votes by basically sweeping the major populated areas, and that was enough to propel him to victory. His election, though, and the Republican election, really for many southern states, was the final nail in the coffin. And within really a few weeks after Lincoln's election, excuse me, they began to move towards secession. And we talked a little bit about this before we left, that the elections held in November of 1860, by December, before Christmas even, by December of 1860, South Carolina has seceded from the Union, followed closely by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, then Louisiana, and then Texas. So all of these blue states here, the deep South states, okay, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, they all secede before the incident at Fort Sumter, which we're going to talk about in a second, and really before Lincoln ever takes office, because he doesn't take office until March of 1861. So these states leave the Union technically while Buchanan is still president, and he does nothing to stop the secession. Lincoln will come in, and Lincoln will uphold his views about protecting federal property. South Carolina, which has seceded, will try to take over a coastal fort, a one named Fort Sumter, and in April of 1861, so just really days almost after Lincoln is sworn in, excuse me, South Carolina will move to seize this fort from federal hands. Lincoln will maintain the idea that this is federal property and must be protected, and so he will not give it up. And a clash breaks out at Fort Sumter. Now, there is fighting. This is really always considered to be the first shots of the Civil War, but it is kind of other than some really the symbolism, it's pretty much a meaningless battle. There's no casualties, but it does kind of indicate how far the nation has come that we are now ready to take up arms against one another. The What really begins to happen next is as we start to gear up to war between the North and the South. We need to take a look at the advantages that each side held. And we've sort of looked at this from several aspects. We did it with the Revolutionary War, we did it with the War of 1812. So, as we begin to fight one another, let's take a look at some of the advantages and disadvantages each side has as we move closer to war. If you look at the North and the South, you'll see that most of the resources and most of the advantage is going to fall within the North. The North has more population, has more money, has more factories, has more food crops, has more horses, and has more railroad track than the South. That's really the only thing the South really competes here with the North is in the production of cotton. But guns are made with metal, not with cotton. And so having the factories in the North is going to be a huge advantage, of course, along with the major monetary deposits as well. If you look at population, okay, the any of these sort of graphs will sort of tell you about how the population broke down in free versus slave states. Okay. And you can see that the North, of course, has more urban population. Okay. Has, as you know, as many as a as many sort of farms. I mean, there's a pretty big discrepancy there. But of course, you know, in the South has more land under cultivation because of cotton. But most of that farmland is planted in cotton, not in food. The uh, the telling sort of thing, some of the telling sort of maps you can look at. This one, for example, and these are railroad lines in the in 1860, and you can see the major difference here. How industrialized and how connected the North is versus how few rail lines really are in the South. Again, when you look at resources, you can really see the difference here. Okay, firearms, for example, there's a huge advantage for the North. Pig iron, a huge advantage. Railroad tracks, okay, value of goods produced, huge differences. And most of those virtually all of these favor the North. So if you had to really sort of figure out who was going to win this war based simply on resources, most of us would think that the North would do very well. And of course, they do eventually win the war, but it is a much bigger struggle than what we sort of first believed. Okay. So when you start looking at men present for duty in the Civil War, you can see that the Union forces are always going to outnumber the Confederate forces throughout the war effort. In 1861, as the war gets going, okay, this is sort of what we're looking at here. Okay, all of these green areas, all of these green states have left the Union. They will turn themselves into a confederacy. They will call themselves the Confederate States of America. They will elect a president. They will write a constitution. The first capital is actually in Montgomery, but will then be moved to Virginia and moved to Richmond, which was never, I thought, a very good idea, but that is what they do. There are several slave states that are technically slave states but do not leave the Union. Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland, the so called border states are technically slave holding states that don't leave the Union. And so these border states will actually remain part of the Union. And of course, these yellow states are free states, and they're the ones that are going to fight on the Union side. The the leaders of the Confederacy, okay, President Jefferson Davis from Mississippi is elected president. Alexander Stephens will serve as the vice president. Jefferson Davis will take the inaugural or take his his inauguration in Montgomery on the steps of the state capitol in Montgomery. The first White House, the first Confederate White House, whoops, sorry, is in Montgomery. But the capital will very soon move to Richmond, and the really the seat of the Confederacy will be in Virginia throughout most of the war. The Jefferson Davis, of course, was viewed rather harshly by the Northern press. And if you look at this sort of very funny thing, Jefferson Davis going to war, then Jefferson Davis returning from war. If you flipped it upside down, then he is this very hairy conqueror going to war. But if you flip it over, it is a jackass, basically. So he has a very low opinion, and of course, you can see why as we start moving towards the war. Militarily, the early strategy was developed by the the Mexican War hero and former candidate for president Winfield Scott. Winfield Scott will come up with the North's really first Civil War strategy, and we call it the Anaconda Plan. And if you know what an anaconda is, anacondas are huge snakes that capture their prey and kill their prey essentially by squeezing it to death. And that is what Winfield Scott's sort of plan was, to encircle the South and then to squeeze it to death. So if you go back here, you can see kind of the elements of the plan. Number one, establish a naval blockade to restrict shipping. So blockade the southern states so that they cannot get their goods out into the markets, and thus they can't really do any sort of trade, get any sort of resources, and they can't sell their cotton. So the other sort of plan was to divide the South, keep pressure on Richmond and Virginia, force the Confederates to defend Richmond, while at the same time drive down the Mississippi and split the western part of the Confederacy from the eastern part of the Confederacy. Okay, and force the South really to defend itself. Excuse me. The South wanted to drag out the war. They felt like dragging out the war was they're in trying to get hope from or trying to get help from abroad would be their best plan. But occasionally they will foray into the north to try to demoralize or divert Union forces, and that happened several times during the war. So this is sort of the strategy. Okay, the as we sort of as we get into the war. One of the things that we find out about this war is that it is a very different war. Many of these generals on both sides will have military experience. Many of them have been educated in the either in war or at West Point. So most of them have a very high degree of education. As a result, both the North and the South will have some pretty exceptional leaders from time to time. These leaders are one of the causes for how devastating this war really is. There's a lot of debate in historical circles about the influence, for example, of West Point, the influence of military education. And all these guys read the same playbooks. They all studied Napoleonic tactics, and they really fought a Napoleonic war, a war more suited for the early 1800s. But by the middle of the 1850s and 1860s, technology had changed. Weapons were getting better, transportation was getting better, communications were getting better. And so when you kind of factor all that in, you fight an old style war with better weapons. In the early 1800s, when Napoleon's armies were fighting on the big battlefields of Europe, the weapons weren't very good. And so to be effective, you had to get pretty close to one another. And you had to to get within range. You fired using volleys to increase your fire and increase the hopes that you actually would hit something. Artillery wasn't as advanced as it will be later on. But by the 1850s and 1860s, weapons were changing a little bit. They were getting a little bit better, and they're going to continue to get better throughout the late 1800s. And so you get better weapons, more lethal weapons, but you're still fighting in a a mindset that forces you to get close to your enemy, to attack your enemy, to get in close to them and try to drive them from the field. And that's going to lead to huge amounts of casualties. The Civil War, the American Civil War, costs Americans more soldiers than any other of our wars really combined. So the lethality of the war is extreme. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But when you talk about technology of the warfare, of the war, you talk about the leadership of the war. They're very educated. Some of these guys are very well educated. And they just simply fight a war with tactics that may have run out of date. I'll give you an example. None of us would, if there were, 15 or 20 of us guarding a hill with modern day machine guns, none of us would try to charge that hill and take it because we would get wiped out, and we know that we would. So, but if we don't know anything about these machine guns, then at least for a while until our learning curve catches up, we might actually try to attack that hill and we would get slaughtered. And in many of these early battles, that's what you're going to start to see. Lincoln will be impatient with many of his generals. And throughout the war, you're going to see him go through several major leaders of the Army. He'll start out with Winfield Scott and the Anaconda Plan. He will move to McDowell, then later to George McClellan, then to Ambrose Burnside, Joseph Hooker, George Meade, all right, back to McClellan again, and then finally with in the war with Ulysses S. Grant. A lot of these guys, they make several mistakes, and that's why they end up getting replaced. McClellan was oftentimes too cautious. Okay, so but Grant will eventually finish the war as the major general the uh, of the Union forces, and this is in fact probably one of the worst parts about the Northern Army is they kind of get into this cycle of leadership. It takes them a while to sort of figure out what kind of war they really want to fight. In the South was blessed with many military leaders who were very good at their jobs. Okay, and there's McClellan, by the way, meeting with the president. But in the South, you had some really impressive military leaders. Stonewall Jackson, who will be a major cavalry commander. All right, George Pickett, he will lead one of the most famous, uh, excuse me, charges at Gettysburg. Longstreet, okay, Nathan Bedford Forrest, Jeb Stuart. and all of them would be bound together by Robert E. Lee. Many of these guys were very well educated. Robert E. Lee had served during the Mexican War. A lot of these other guys had gone through West Point and were graduates of West Point, so they were very good at their jobs. And throughout really most of the war, the South had maybe an advantage with its leaders. Now, that does not mean that they always make the best decisions, because they don't. Okay, but they are very capable at certain periods, especially, of course, Lee. The uh, the first real fighting will take place in July of 1861. There is a battle right outside of Washington D.C. Called the first. It's the first Battle of Bull Run. The Southerners call it First Battle of Manassas. So there is a battle right outside of Washington D.C. early in the war. So Bull Run is right here. You can see Washington is right here. So there were some. Excuse me. There were some Confederate movements here, and the uh, the uh, the Union Army will move to intercept. Okay, so McDowell runs an army out here to fight Beauregard, PGT Beauregard, and the first Battle of Bull Run takes place. Now, it's a minor, in a lot of ways, a minor little skirmish outside of Washington. People actually kind of ran out and threw out their picnic blankets to kind of watch the show. And the show that they watched turns out to be a very bloody battle. So, kind of a minor engagement right outside of Washington between these two forces in July of 1861. Notice what happens here. Okay. McDowell had about 17,500 men. Beauregard had roughly about the same, a little bit more at 18,000. But between the two, you had almost, we had over 800 people killed, uh, almost, well, 2,600 wounded. Okay. And so when you look at the losses on both sides, they're huge, okay, for a pretty minor engagement. So this is a harbinger, I guess, of what's about to happen, and how bloody and violent the war is going to become. There's a lot of fighting in this particular area over the next few months. Okay, there's actually naval battles between ironclad ships and the river systems up through here. So there are actually several major battles that are going to be fought here. Okay, Bull Run in July of 1861, and then the second Battle of Bull Run almost, well, a little over a year later. So the 1860, 1861, 1860 sees a lot of fighting right around this northern Virginia, Richmond area. So Lee has to protect Richmond, and so there's a lot of fighting in and around this area between Richmond and Washington, D.C. The probably the when you look at the kind of the map here, you can see some of the major battles, okay, throughout this period. But by September of 1862, we're going to kind of focus in right up here, because we'll have our first real major battle take place at Antietam. Lee decides to sort of push his way into Union territory, and so he actually will sort of blast his way up here towards Maryland. And a major engagement is going to take place at Antietam in September of 1862. The Antietam is the bloodiest single day of the war, and one of your assignments for this time, the assignment really I'm going to have you guys do, is to watch a little video about Antietam and to write about it. But Antietam is the single bloodiest day of the war. There are over 23,000 casualties during the battle, and it is certainly a wake-up call. Lincoln and his forces have not been doing all that well. And to be honest, the Confederates are doing well if you want to go back to their strategy of hanging on, but they're certainly not necessarily winning the war. And so that's going to lead to a change in some of the ideas of the war. And Lincoln is going to change the scope of the war when he deals with emancipation in 1863. All right, we're going to stop here. Okay, this is our first sort of lecture about the early days of the war. And so we're going to stop here. Okay, look for your assignment. That'll be about Antietam, and that'll be your homework to show that you watched the video and that you are participating in the class. Okay, and of course, it'll be a homework assignment as well. All right, tomorrow I'll try to put up the second part of this, and by Wednesday, I hope to have our last lecture up, and that way we'll be kind of through with that material. All right.